You're listening to Make Planning Make Sense. I'm Aaron and I'm a director at Central Planning Consultancy. Today, my colleague and co-host Alex Roth and I are speaking with Paul Willis, Transport Director at Yes Engineering. Today's episode speaks to the heart of why we created this podcast, giving a voice to practitioners on the front line to inform the public conversation about what works, what doesn't work, and what we can do to make planning make sense. On the podcast, we tend to oscillate between the grandiose and the granular, the challenges and frustrations and anxieties that are not inevitable, but are unavoidable given the ways that the planning system is currently structured. The episode demonstrates how navigating these challenges is a key component of the value that an experienced practitioner will add to the planning process. Until effective reform occurs, getting things done at all is a valuable and marketable skill. The episode is also a reminder that we could all be getting more done with far less frustration if the planning process worked in a healthy way. And we talk about what some of those process-orientated reforms can look like. As always, find us on Instagram, X, Blue Sky, and YouTube at MPMS Podcast. Remember to give the podcast a follow on your preferred listener platform. And remember, you can always reach us directly at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Here is our conversation with Paul Willis. Paul Willis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
We always like to start with a little bit about yourself and how you came to your role.
Yeah, no, I've almost been doing this for around 30 years. I started a small consultancy called Betteridge & Turner and Partners many years back, then moved on to Atkins, the big boys, and then we ended up at Arcadius. There was like a buyout, so we ended up there. And then about 15 years ago, me and Catherine, who's another fellow director, decided that, look, actually working for large organisations is very difficult when you're trying to deal with very quick, fast-moving developers who need an answer straight away.
Right.
And when you're working for a large consultancy, it's very difficult to do that.
Just administratively,
yes,
with getting the file set up and whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't touch a job until you get a job number. You've got to go through various forms, go, no-go forms, what's their financial viability, all of these things. But most of these developers are very fast-moving and they've got options on sites and they need to know yesterday, is that viable? And that's probably 75% of our business. They will come to us and say, look, Paul, we've got this site. Is it viable? Can we get access? What could it lead to? Do we need to do any junction improvements? Whatever it might be.
Because time is money, right?
Yes, and it's got to be quick. And the larger consultancies are there for the big strategic schemes, but it's very difficult for them to deal with the smaller schemes. And most house building, it generally is small to medium-sized developers who build 50 houses here, 20 here, and that's where most of the housing stock comes from. We set up about 15 years ago with Yes Engineering, and I say obviously we've crossed paths on various projects, and it's a small world out there. So that's how I end up becoming a director here.
Lovely. So first things first, the government and the Mayor of London have just announced a package of support for house building in the capital, where house building has rather collapsed with a combination of factors: viability, building safety regulator, demand side being sluggish, and the sort of onerous and competing priorities for, say, a ground floor or for building efficiency ratios in the London plan.
Purely from my sort of niche market in transport and highways, it's interesting that cycle parking comes up in literally every project we do.
I know, right?
And it puts such pressure on the ground floor for developers to make it viable. Often you find ground floors with hundreds of cycles, and we do want to move into more sustainable modes, but it's probably just gone too far the other way, and they're probably unrealistic.
Yeah.
And when there's pressure to build houses and make it work economically, that land use probably could be used for other or better purposes, whether that's commercial or residential, whatever it might be. Particularly as you could have a ground floor that's largely redundant, full of bins and cycles. As interesting as that might be, it becomes a real factor on many schemes, large and small.
Yeah, Marco was making this point in the previous episode that tends to be a workaround throttle on density. Oh, we don't have a problem with the height of the building or whatever, but the competition for ground floor space, or maybe the challenge that each of these siloed sort of consultees presents when then somebody says, why don't you just build a basement? And the applicant's always like, do you have any idea how expensive a basement is?
Absolutely. I mean, the number of schemes we have at the moment where perhaps they got planning 2 years ago and they did have basements and things, but obviously the pressure on developers at the moment because of the build costs means that they're all going back in for planning or Section 73 applications. The amount of those we're doing at the moment is incredible because they don't stack up financially. That's to do with cycle parking or bins that also present challenges to architects, which I'm sure Marco in your previous podcast might have alluded to, but you end up having dead space on the ground floor. That's very difficult for architects, etc., to comply with the standards, and the standards that go with those are onerous, and it makes it very difficult for them to design anything other than a very large dead space that could be better used.
Yeah, if it's a massive site or if it's a master planned area, then there's going to be more space. What I like about what the Mayor of London and the government have done is that they've recognized the cycle parking being particularly onerous, and they've also packaged that with some other changes like the number of units per floor and maybe a relaxation about the idea of a flat needing to be dual aspect. That one is always a pet peeve for me because I don't live in a dual aspect flat in terms of ventilation. And what happens when I open my balcony door? Air comes through. Like, I also have a pet peeve about mechanical ventilation because if you don't have that, then like damp is going to be an issue. And then also you're just going to buy a fan anyway.
Opening a window has been reasonably a thing that people have been doing for hundreds of years, and it works.
Yeah, and maybe there is traffic noise outside or poor air quality outside, and that is important to consider. But then just allow mechanical ventilation. It's just a fan, but it's built in. That's not going to be the knife's edge for stemming climate change or not.
I don't need to tell you, but obviously...
Tell the listener, Paul.
To build in London, to comply with all the various standards, all the different disciplines, is almost impossible. It's so constrained.
Yeah.
You're not going to comply with everything, the rights of light, air quality, transport, something we'll have to give on literally every site that we deal with.
I completely agree. And I get why we should be forward-facing about cycle parking. It's not about how many people cycle now. It's about changing the mode share over the course of the life of that building. But I hope that this is a lesson learned for the policymaking team at the GLA, that we can't be 100% aspirational about everything. And the other thing that I hope becomes a lesson learned from this relief package is that the silos need to talk to each other. So it's a development management thing, but it's a policymaking thing.
I mean, that is a day-to-day issue with our job. Much of this comes down to guidance, and the clues in the name it is guidance. But the day-to-day thing is you'll find that unless you comply exactly with what is set out there, then the answer is no. You know, if you're converting a building, for example, we do lots of those, you're never going to be able to get the cycle parking in accordance with standards. There needs to be flexibility, and there needs to be a common sense approach to that. If you're 2 cycle parking spaces short and it's going to stop 40 flats going up that we need, there needs to be a common sense approach. But it happens all the time. We do this on a daily basis. We all know the visibility display might be out by 2 meters.
Yeah.
And they're not going to allow 100 flats because of it. But there's already been an entrance there for the last 100 years, and there's cars going in and out of it. You need someone with the relevant experience to sit there and go, actually, that's not an issue. There's plenty of guidance that suggests reduced visibility actually makes people take more care, for example.
We were involved in an office to hotel conversion. I won't say which authority, but it was central West London. And the initial application was refused because there was not adequate level surface access to cycle parking, even though on the pre-app, everybody was understanding of the fact that there are stairs up to the unit, there can't be level access anywhere to the building, and it's inadequate cycle parking for an office too.
Yeah.
Is this building now unusable, or...
That gets to the point, doesn't it?
But we got there.
It's some of these buildings that they need to be developed, but you're thwarted and you're like, something's got to give somewhere, otherwise it's never going to be developed. And as we all know, it could be in planning for years when it should be in planning for weeks.
Yeah.
You're going backwards and forwards on the same thing, and the officer a change, or it just never ends.
Oh, that's another one. We should do an episode on like officer turnover because that is like the reset clock.
Yeah.
The officer left, but they said everything is done and they've written their report. No.
What's the most amount of officers you've had on one application?
4.
Yeah, I've touched on this before, actually. In London particularly, that officer turnover is huge. As soon as you go outside of London, actually, I think you get people that have been there a lot longer. They're probably local to the area and they stay in that area, and quite often they're in that job for many years. And in general, I'd say you get a more pragmatic approach. Also, you can approach them directly, where in London, trying to approach any officer is virtually impossible because there is no contact these days unless you go via the pre-app. And once you go to the pre-app, you're still bound by having to go to the planning officer, who's probably completely overwhelmed with many projects.
Yeah.
And me as a highways engineer, I want to speak to the highways officer.
That's another interesting sort of way to look at that inside London versus outside London disparity, which has come up a few times in other conversations that we've had. So turnover could actually be one of the reasons that there is a different approach or a different culture within planning inside the M25.
Before we stray too far away from the mayor's and the government's policy note, on the topic of something's got to give, do you think these are the right few things in terms of design guidance to give?
What's your hot take? Yeah, that's a good question.
It's a very good question, actually. I do think when it comes to my particular discipline, that is an area that is a real bugbear for every developer and every architect, because I end up generally being the bad guy. And the scheme will end up on my desk and they'll say, Paul, how many cycle spaces, how many bins do we need? And okay, I'll work it all out. And I'm sorry, but you need 350. And they're like, how are we going to put these?
Yeah.
And the pressure that then puts on, and they're, Paul, can we cut this down? I'm like, I'm really sorry, but these are minimum standards. They're like non-negotiable. And authorities, whilst they have the powers to just use them as general guidance, they don't. They say they're minimum. We need to comply with the London plan. That's it. And it's black and white as that. And then I throw in, actually, you've now also got to get a 12-metre refuse lorry on site. Sorry, that's just wiped the entire ground floor out, because, again, that is also a London plan policy that servicing, in the first instance, is meant to be on site, which is something they possibly could look at as well. But it is a huge pressure on developers and really tricky for architects to navigate around.
Yeah, because everybody wants to be right at the frontage.
Yeah, exactly. You think, we put the bins out the back. But then, actually, when people ask you, you can't put the bins out the back because they can only will them a certain distance, but particularly if it's a flatted development, they only go 10 metres.
Yeah.
We've all been there, and it's, I'm afraid the rule distance is now 11 metres. It's unacceptable. And you're like, so we're going to stop 200 flats because it's 1 metre out.
Yeah.
And we're like, someone needs to make a informed, common sense decision that actually, I think that extra 1 metre will be okay. But we joke, but it's not a laughing matter.
Do we joke?
Because the amount of times that will turn up that the drag distance is marginally too far, and therefore they are recommending refusal.
Yeah, somebody needs to make a decision, and it turns out that there's a term for that. It's a decision maker, and that's where the planning balance is meant to
the planning balance is
in defense of the decision maker. Notionally, if you're a decision maker and would like to be on a podcast, let us know. My guess is that they are as fatigued as we are.
Yeah,
that they have the exact same conversations about, in principle, competing priorities amongst their consultees, but they also don't want to just start systematically pissing off their colleagues.
Absolutely, yeah.
They might not feel that they have the experience or maybe the support of a strategic level sort of senior officer who is going to have their back.
No, absolutely. They're going to have 10, 15 consultees, as mad as that sounds, from air quality, noise, highways, rights of light. They're all going to land on their desk, and they've got to look at all of those responses and then try and come to an informed position. And yes, they probably are completely overwhelmed with all that information.
But what's the anxiety there? What do you think? Obviously, we can't speak for them, but what do you think is the sort of hesitation there to say, actually, that extra 1 meter is going to be fine? Is it that, they're thinking on aggregate, oh my gosh, that bin lorry is going to have to, they're going to have to get out and drag the bins a meter extra at every development, and then on aggregate, that's just going to be a complete disaster?
Roll the bins, by the way. It's called drag distance. That's like the industry standard term, but it's a roll distance, guys.
Yeah, it is. It comes to responsibility. There's probably not enough experienced people available to help and work on majority of these schemes, and no one kind of wants to put their head above the parapet and say, actually, I've looked at the guidance. This 1 metre won't make any difference. 2 cycle less won't make any difference. We'll be absolutely fine. The turnover of officers is huge. So therefore, where are they getting their experience from? Traditionally, you get experience from your older colleagues who help you out all the time, but I don't think they exist anymore. And it makes it really difficult for any of them to stand up and say, actually, no, I've looked at that. I've taken that on board, and we're going to build 100 flats, and we're going to overlook that actually cycle parking doesn't quite work, or bin store isn't quite where they want it to be.
And the bin store and the cycle parking would quite work, but just aren't in accordance with the let's ask for as much as we possibly can in setting a standard work. Syntactically, I don't know if that works, but I think that there's also a little bit of a culture issue as well, right? That if we just say, no, that's not the standard, try again, we can really push the envelope on the applicant and just make them think harder. And to my mind, it really does fly in the face of why our job exists, which is to front load the work for them. And if we're getting to the point that we've presented something because we have participated in those DTMs. We have advised on these things. We have faced the sort of trade-offs and whatever. Give us a little bit of faith, right?
Perhaps they worry that if they give an inch on one scheme, someone's going to try and take 2 inches in the other scheme. Like perhaps that comes into their mindset that they think developers are always going to push the boundaries.
Yeah.
And obviously, we are there to try and maximise the scheme. That's why inherently we're all working in this industry. But perhaps they are worried about that. That said, if you work on some of the schemes outside London, it generally tends to be a bit more pragmatic and slightly easier. And I've said it before, I think you generally have officers that have generally outside London been working there for a long time. West Sussex, for example, we've done quite a few jobs there, and actually you go for pre-up there, it's free, and they are very good. Yes, it's free. Really good advice. The feedback is amazing.
Wow.
And it's really helpful. But what that means is actually that process takes a tenth of the time. You straight away, okay, you need to do X, Y, and Z to get this through and demonstrate it. You satisfy the officer that it all works. Or it doesn't work, but there's mitigation that will allow it to work. But in London, it's so much more tricky. You don't see the same officer generally twice, and you're never allowed the direct contact with your peer on the council to try and have a conversation with them.
If you just have a conversation about it, you've saved yourself 4 emails. And so it feels inefficient to just be on the phone, but that is fantastically more efficient. And you get to actually talk about it live and get to some position, or at least get to some sort of agreed action point for us, for them, and you can go from there.
Well, I think that leads into pre-apps in general. As in, I think when they first came out, the idea sounded great. Everyone get around the table. But as we all know now, pre-apps, I would suggest, highly clog up the system and do not do what they're meant to do. Unfortunately, we want a pre-app. Okay, we can give you one in 3 months. Developers probably sat on that land, paying a huge amount of money in mortgages or whatever else. And then we all turn up and the planning officer is dragged on, and there'd be no one from highways there. There'd be no one from design there, or whoever it might be. So you're sat there, and the developers obviously paid a fortune for this, and I can't have a chat with the highways person because they're not there. And then we're going to have to wait several weeks for the response back. And the response back will just be a standard response. Please do a transport assessment and a travel plan. Okay, but why? And what do I need to demonstrate? What's the issues? If I wanted to ask those questions, I can't. I then have to go back to the poor old planning officer who's dealing with everyone's.
If you need further information, then this will be subject to a new pre-app.
I just want to ask, do we need to provide more parking? Do we need less parking? Do we need to do a survey? I'm sure the planning officer is highly stressed at this point that we have 20 questions and none of them are answered in the pre-app.
From our perspective, when a client says, oh, do we need to do a pre-app? So we understand what the submission requirements are. The answer is no.
There's a bit of checklist.
We tell our clients the only time that there's really a need for a pre-app, or that it's even going to add a value, is where there's a subjective issue that needs to be discussed so we can understand that decision maker's perspective, right? So design, heritage, townscape. Or if there's a genuine policy conflict from the development plan and we need a steer on priorities. We've definitely been in pre-apps that have cost thousands and thousands of pounds, and you're at the table and it's frosty and they say, you're going to need to do an air quality neutral assessment. Yeah, we know. Thanks for that. But then you start talking about design and say, oh, you guys haven't read it. I get everyone's really busy. We've also waited maybe a month for that pre-app meeting to occur. I would rather that they get in touch the day before and say, I honestly have not read the materials. Instead of just kind of rock up.
You turn up
sometimes.
You turn up and you say it's frosty. It's interesting you say, unfortunately, that is the kind of general feeling when you go to most pre-apps. It's almost feel like you're there for a battle rather than actually to work together. I can't remember the last time I sat in one where everyone goes, well, that looks a really good scheme. Just perhaps give this a tweak and that a tweak. But it generally isn't. It's not, everyone sort of walks out, let's go and grab a coffee and discuss that because it didn't sound very good. And then you go from there, which I think is a shame, because I do think when the pre-apps first came out, the idea sounded great, but it doesn't generally pan that way, does it? It's generally more of a battle than it is a positive working together relationship to come up with the best scheme possible.
So there's actually 3 things. There's the cost, the culture, and then the purpose. The culture thing's a really difficult point. It was something that I needed to learn at the start of my career in planning because it doesn't seem obvious, but I learned it quite quickly. We're there to write a planning statement and give them a nice sort of prepackaged assessment of the scheme in relation to the development plan and material considerations. We're also really there for the interpersonal respect building. because if they don't trust anybody, if they don't respect anybody who's just submitted information, you're going to have a much more difficult time even understanding what their priorities are amongst conflicting policies. So it just becomes so essential to have that mutual respect. And for me, and I think for Centra, I would say part of that is having the patience that they're snowed under, they're overwhelmed, they've had enough applications where the information is bad. And you have to be like, yeah, but that's not us. Or look, what you're passionate about is just not in scope. And so you have to have these frank conversations. Cost. We were talking about this earlier. In the London Borough of Ealing, a pre-app for anywhere from 10 to 99 residential units is £14,000.
Crikey. I think I would want a fully designed scheme for that.
I would say if there's a set of actions, right, if we were to distill the whole podcast, all the takeaways, one of those items has to be for pre-applications not to be profiteering.
Yeah, all the reports we do wouldn't come to that.
Right,
It would be interesting to know what that would cover, because I joke, but I would want some sort of design scheme to come forward.
Probably 2 months off. You can have 2 months off.
Yeah, that does seem a lot of money. I'd want a very good response back for that.
Yeah. So either they have a director working on it for 8 straight weeks and only that, or it's profiteering. And the worst thing is that sometimes those expensive pre-apps are also the ones, I'm not talking about Ealing here, but sometimes a pre-app is both incredibly expensive and the officers aren't prepared. That's really problematic.
It is problematic. That goes back to what I was saying earlier, isn't it? If you can have that direct contact with an officer and say, we've got this scheme coming forward, can we have a quick conversation?
Yeah.
It would be, I know they talk about streamlining planning, but as it currently stands, things need to change quite significantly.
Yeah.
The pre-app process is, I'm afraid, isn't quite there. It's broken. It doesn't really work in general. Even when people sign like a PPA agreement, the amount of arguments I've seen where they said, look, we paid your PPA agreement and it costs a huge sums of money. And you see the planning consultant chasing a response saying, can we have a response? We signed this very expensive PPA agreement. We're due another meeting. Can we see the latest design with you? Oh, sorry, no one's available. But we signed an agreement.
Yeah. And it's a shame that chasing up an officer or whomever to say, not only are you supposed to be doing this in 13 weeks anyway, but we've signed this PPA. So now we have paid a lot of money for a pinky promise that you actually are going to just engage with us. Writing that email to say, we even paid you extra. Can you just engage with us, which is also the job, is really, it's really frustrating, frankly, as an agent, because that's not what I want to be writing.
Unfortunately, you know your client, we're going, Aaron, have we got a response back? And you're like, I've tried. Yeah. And it can be very difficult when you're dealing with an authority that doesn't respond. And then you've got your client phoning you quite rightly, asking you, and you're like, I'm trying, here's the email trail. Yep. I've tried phoning, but you can't phone because there is no direct dial. There's no direct response to go in there.
Because the applicants team isn't a monolith. We're not all just standing at the line of scrimmage with our arms crossed, tapping our feet, being mad. We're answering to our client. We're advising on what's going on. And sometimes it's literally like, but when we do get through that shell and we can have that mutual respect, and we can understand where the officer's coming from, they can understand where we're coming from, not only is that just a more enjoyable life to live, it's much more effective.
It's so much more. If you could just have that conversation, we keep saying it, but if you can have that conversation, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
We were doing a construction logistics plan in Merton. Officer there, absolutely fantastic. We could phone him up. He said, please phone us up before you submit to agree all the finer points together, because it's a tricky report. The construction, it can be very challenging. And we went through it together, all done and dusted in a matter of days. Whereas I can flip that to
ideal
most other boroughs, and that will not happen.
Yeah.
You would just receive a response saying that condition's not acceptable, and there's been no opportunity to amend it beforehand. That's also a frustration, just to tweak something, and then you literally receive an email saying this has been refused. And it might be the most simple thing that you could just change, and you would have it back on their desk the same day.
We'll be right back.
What is a possible solution to this, though? Personally, I'm always coming at these sort of questions from the perspective that there's no use anybody crossing their arms and saying, harumph, I wish that they would just trust us. The best way to look at these kinds of questions is the design of the process itself. How do you feel about pre-application advice not being offered without prejudice? Because that's another favorite thing of mine, right? They'll say, this is what we want, this is acceptable, or here are the benchmarks that we need to demonstrate, without prejudice though. And then you do all of that stuff, which costs hours of my life, hours of the whole team's life, the client's money, and then you submit it. And then that same consultee says, well, I also want this. How do we remove what I do think is fair to call vigilantism in consultation? Discuss.
I don't know, really. It's a tricky one. Years ago, we used to just write one report. We'd do a transport assessment that would cover off all of the above that you just mentioned. Whereas now, it doesn't matter the size of the scheme. I had one yesterday on my desk for 2 units, and we're doing 6 reports.
Yeah.
It's insane. It does not need that. It's in central London. And the only way you can physically travel is sustainably. There'd be no car parking. You're right next to Waterloo Station, yet you've got to do a travel plan.
Yeah.
And that sounds, oh yes, just do a travel plan, submit that. But it's not just that, is it? Because you do that and there'll be a condition for that travel plan to continue for the next 5 years. That could cost the applicant a 6-figure sum to do all the monitoring, all the surveys, all the reports that go with that.
For a scheme that's already going to be car-free by legal obligation.
Yes, already car-free. It's in the middle of central London with a PTEL of 6, and you have to do a travel plan. It's incredible.
I think that there's this control issue, right? So Laurie Handcock says planning is essentially all about control. And he's right, because it's a regulatory industry. And we were joking. I was like, oh, that's so toxic. But there are certain things that I think people want to regulate because they feel responsible to be coming up with the questions. We were just involved in a pre-app where the proposal included some community use. And the officer mentioned, we're concerned about over-provision of community uses. And I'm like, what? Over-provision of community uses is just not a planning consideration.
There's never enough community uses either, is there?
And I think the travel plans are along this vein, right? Because how are people going to get around the same way that they did before cars existed, because they're not going to be able to use one? That's it.
But I think we touched on it with the information that came out today with the GLA talking about reducing the cycle parking and things like that. Perhaps that was another one that they could have thrown in there. If it's a PTEL of 4 and above, clearly you're not going to need a travel plan. Everyone's going to be travelling sustainably. It's one less thing that the developer needs to pay for. And not only do they need to do that, they'll submit a travel plan with the application, which that could be conditioned. If you want a travel plan, absolutely fine. Condition it. No, that needs to be up front. A draft one will be up front. There'd be a draft construction logistics plan up front. There'd be a draft delivery and servicing plan up front. There'd be a draft parking management plan up front, even though it's only got 2 disabled blue badge bays. Yeah. All of those could be conditioned.
I'm reminded of the planning practice note that the GLA released in December, reminding decision makers that their, say, housing design standards guidance and all their other LPG guidance is just guidance, guys. You don't really want to refuse an application because you can see the lift shaft overrun from the street. Is this most recent sort of relief package a reminder that they could be doing that more frequently? The London plan was adopted 4 years ago.
Yeah, and each local authority, they don't have to apply it rigidly.
Exactly, but knowing that they do, and maybe the GLA doesn't know this, but they should, knowing that they still do tend to apply these things rigidly, things like dual aspect. Do you think maybe there's an opportunity for strategic regional authorities like the GLA to maybe say more frequently when things are under review? Guys, what if they had said earlier, actually, the 8 units per core per floor standard is actually making buildings really inefficient, and it's not actually fostering community connection?
Absolutely. As you say, it definitely could go further, and the discussion to say this is guidance. I find it amazing. A 2-unit scheme ends up on my desk in the first place. You don't need a highways engineer to tell you that the impact for 2 units is going to be effectively nothing. And I think NPPF, we always say paragraph 116 says it should only be refused if the impact is severe. Quite clearly, 2 units, no matter if they don't provide enough car parking, is never going to be severe. Yet this applicant is going to have to write a transport assessment, a travel plan, and everything else for 2 units.
No, but it's interesting that they focused on design requirements, right? Now we're talking about evidence requirements. Design requirements are going to be much more impactful in terms of GDV and cost. And in comparison, I suppose evidence requirements, the cost of doing the travel plan for a period of 5 years, I'm not sure, but maybe it just is less significant than that design of the cost of having that 8 units per core per floor.
But what goes with that is, let's just say we have to do our 4-6 reports. That's then stuck in planning for someone, for the design team to look at.
Someone has to read it.
Someone's going to have to read all of those reports, and it's not just going to be the highways officer, it's going to be the environmental officer, it's going to be the disability officer. They're all going to read those reports. So therefore, that means that's stuck in planning again for all of that length of time. If we want to streamline the planning, let's just have one report like we always used to. As we just mentioned, you can condition a construction logistic plan, you can condition a delivery and service plan if they're required, but they'll all be contained within that one report. But if someone's got to read all 6 reports, it's going to take a long time, and that's going to cost more money in planning and more money for the developer that might have a mortgage or an option on a site. So there's still a significant cost. You've got to streamline this thing to make it so much quicker.
So what I'm hearing is a plea to the policymaking team to give your development management colleagues a break and start making them review travel plans for 8 units.
Yeah, they've got to deal with just 6 reports from me alone, and on top of everyone else, on top of rights of light.
And the sector is suffering from these self-inflicted wounds.
Yeah, it just doesn't need all of these.
Yeah.
It never did.
No.
And now it does. You have all of these, as we said, on top of going through the pre-app process. Yeah. The most simple application, you're in for it for a couple of years.
What if we, as a sector, were able to take on-street car parking stress explicitly out of the planning balance? What if there was an NDMP to say off limits?
Yeah, I agree. The amount of times we have to do parking stress surveys, for example. I can refer back to the scheme I was talking about before. If we want a parking stress survey and a transport assessment, to say, okay, there's 2 extra units here. Seriously, the MPPF talks about only refusing if the impact is severe. Clearly, parking from 2 units is never going to be severe, yet the applicant is going to have to go through all of that just to try and get 2 units in.
Yeah.
And it's unnecessary, isn't it? As someone that has to do this on a day, the impact is going to be absolutely minimal.
It is one of those things that comes up so frequently. I might even pose the question, is that an in principle throttle on densification in
absolutely.
London?
But again, this goes back like the travel plan thing. The amount of times you requested by the local authority to do a parking stress survey, and it's probably a PTEL of 4+ in a controlled parking zone. Why are we doing this?
Is it not a moral failing to prioritise that over housing delivery?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if I'm being crazy.
But my point is, so many of them that land on our desk are in a high PTEL in the middle of London. They're not going to be allowed to have a parking permit in any event. And then we're doing surveys that are not insignificant costs that take time. Again, that means you're stuck in the planning system for that much longer to these surveys come out. And then you get the results back. And then obviously they're meaningless because they can't own a car in any event. You've had to do that because without that, they're not accepting the application.
Yeah. I think I would be comfortable saying in London, unless the PTAL is like really abysmal, then no, it will not make a difference. It does not matter. Full stop. I think that is different outside of London in some cases.
Absolutely. If you're outside London, on the edge of London, and the public transport is very low, lots of people own cars, you want to know what the impact's going to be, particularly if you've got a large development. You put 100 houses on there, is that going to saturate the streets and make it very difficult for people to get past, and for pedestrians, people might park indiscriminately. You need to know, particularly in London, to try and streamline things. We're talking about reducing circle parking and things like this. Again, this comes back to the policy ones. You don't need to do this.
I'm trying to think of the right way to put this, but if a local authority isn't meeting their housing supply, like badly not meeting their housing supply minimum requirements, I honestly don't care if parking becomes really effing impossible on those streets. And I do recognize that some people are going to need cars, right? Either just as a matter of like convenience, which becomes a matter of sanity if you've got kids and you're taking them all around, or as a matter of genuine accessibility. So I don't think on-street car parking is bad. But what I'm trying to chew on here is that idea of, but what if it does make a difference in some areas? I actually don't want to hear it unless you're meeting your housing land supply. That's something you get to waffle about if you're delivering enough homes, because in principle, the priorities there are just absolutely incomparable, in my view. And I am picturing a very sort of zone 2 to zone 4, probably 10-minute walk from a station kind of places, right? Like Lower Sydenham, whatever.
Yeah.
In those cases, a parking beat survey and a parking stress survey become this implicit sort of test that the housing is only going to be acceptable if it doesn't increase the competition for public space.
Yes, you would never build there, would you?
Ding,
Yeah.
ding. As long as nobody notices, as long as nobody else is going to be using these shared spaces, as long as there's no increased competition for car parking, then it's acceptable. That's a pretty wet blanket on that little flame.
Yeah, well, you're not wrong, because you just made effectively you're never going to develop.
What are the priorities?
You're never going to.
Housing's great as long as no one notices it going up.
Interestingly, where we work outside London, we have a sort of flip scenario, and this is becoming more and more prevalent. Lots of the sites that we do outside London, it's a countryside site, and he might be developing barns or whatever it might be. Yes,
Keep coming up.
Class Q application. The amount of pushback we keep getting because they're not in sustainable locations. So it's the same thing. If you're going to refuse it on that, you're never going to develop any of these sites, which inherently they're saying that you're never going to be able to build outside the built envelope ever.
It's the same thing in the sense that it's the inverse.
Yes, the opposite. And we're finding that honestly all the time. And the frustrating thing again here is NPPF, again, is quite clear about this, is that you can't compare the two urban and rural locations. And it's incredibly frustrating. You point them towards the NPPF and it says, look, you can't, yes, there is no footways here. People have lived in this village for hundreds of years. There's never been any footways. Everyone walks along the side of the road. Yes, and they don't want a footway along there because that's where they choose to live and that's how it is. But effectively, they're saying you could never build here. Yet, once they make a decision, this is also a pet peeve, is how many times does anyone ever go, actually, we've looked at that, we've got that wrong. Yes, it will be fine.
It goes to this fundamental question as well of like, how far can we optimize the infrastructure we already have before we reach a sort of carrying capacity limit, before we actually have to build some new infrastructure?
Yeah,
right?
But if you don't build in some of these villages where they need some houses, otherwise their children have to move further away and they can't live in that village, those villages will all gradually die because there's no new people living there and no people going to the shops and everything else. You've got to have some sort of development.
What would you love to see in the next London plan? Or if you want to go super big picture, NDMPs, what would you love to see change?
Yeah, we've touched on before. Everyone talks about streamlining the planning process. And it's you don't need to do all those reports. We could be in and out of planning so much faster if we didn't have to do all those reports. Dialogue, that's the key one. As I said before, pre-apps sound great and that they should be great, but they're not and they don't work. And we need to get to a point where we can have dialogue directly with officers so that we can come to an understanding much quicker than we do now.
My God, I would love to charge 14 grand to be like, look at the air quality policy. Could you imagine?
Yeah, my heart sinks slightly when I go to a local authority and you want to get an answer. And when I see the response and I know full well that actually they don't work for the local authority, they're subcontracted out. And it happens quite a lot in our field. And whilst that sounds great, yes, okay, you've got a private company that's outsourced to reply on highways. The reality of it is, and we all know for any of us that's worked in a big firm, is that what's probably happened is that large firm is sent a graduate out there to make a decision on that and they don't have the necessary experience. Yeah. They're left alone there. I'm sure someone will try and contradict me and say that this is not what happened, but I know it is. I've worked for a large firm and that's how it is because that's where you make your best profit margin. They're generally not local people that have the knowledge of that area and they will literally look at policy or guidance and say it doesn't comply X, Y and Z and that is it. And you can't contact them because obviously they are remote from somewhere else and you're like, can we have a conversation? It's no, we don't do that. You have to go via the officer and we give our response. And you're like, this could be done in 5 minutes.
So that's the kind of response back where you get a comment from a consultancy that says, 11 meters roll distance.
They're able to fill in their timesheet and put the hours against it. And perhaps cynically of me, their timesheet gets nicely filled up each time that they respond.
There's always a top up to a third party representation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredibly frustrating. Yeah. I was involved in a local plan inquiry on behalf of a parish council. And they were looking at allocated sites. It was an allocated site for a few thousand houses. The inspector said to me, Mr. Willis, do you not think the Highway Authority will have a good handle of where the traffic is likely to go? And I was like, absolutely. I said, however, when I look at the Highway Authority here in this room, I know none of them actually work for the Highway Authority. They all work for a large consultancy.
This is like a courtroom reveal.
And there was a bit of stunned silence to my response. But I was like, with all due respect, the parish council who live here, whilst they might not be highways experts, I'm sure they have a better handle on where people are driving to and from and the local routes because these people live there, they know it. Yeah. And that was the end of that conversation when I said, yes, the Highway Authority should, but effectively there's probably only one person there that works at the Highway Authority. Everyone else is consulted out.
Plus, like, if we're just taking tricks data and then using Google Maps recommended routes or whatever, That's not that's not a profession.
Again, we had another one. It's a large housing scheme, like 500 houses. They had one highway officer in the council and the rest of the department was subcontracted out.
Wow.
It's incredible.
How did they split that work? What did that one person do?
I think they just employed someone else to reply. And this is, I mean, he got to the point. So we're doing 500 houses. At the 11th hour, they changed consultants and they hadn't had highway response back in 10 months.
Oh my gosh.
They're due to go to committee a week later. Oh. They brought on a new consultancy who then looked at the plans and said, oh, it doesn't comply with cycle parking. We're like,
honey, we know.
We're like, yes, we know this because this is what was requested by the previous people. And here's the breakdown. And here's the head of highways who was CC'd on all of this. And they were like, oh, okay. I'm like, what do you want us to do? We're literally going to committee in a couple of days. It did go to committee. Fortunately, it's one of those cases where always keep your emails.
Yeah. Too often there's that 11th hour scramble, right?
My heart sank, I have to say, because the amount of work that we put in for 2 years to produce this very sustainable scheme that was led on cycling and car sharing. And then they've come in and said, oh, that doesn't comply with that. In fact, their policy for this particular council is 25 years old.
Wait, say that again?
Yes, it was like 20, I think it's 20 years old. I think it was 2004, I think. So that's what their transport policy was based on. And obviously they're referring to that. I'm like, that's well gone.
The authority will support the transition from steam to diesel trains. Yeah. There's a parallel there between the high turnover of officers and the outsourcing of consultation, isn't there? In those cases, it would be great if there were just a continuity where the next officer says, look, okay, frankly, personally, I think that the bike store is more of a priority than the bin store. My predecessor on this case disagrees and they think the other way around. But we're just going to give you the continuity here.
Yeah, we're going to go what was previously
agreed. You don't have
agreed.
to start from square one again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've all been there.
And we shall again. We shall again, I'm sure. I think this is a good place to end. Paul Willis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
That's
really
great. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my colleague and co-host, Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague, Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague, Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.